Please enjoy a quick little visit to the Fort Montgomery Battle Site Museum site. They have a good number of events happening, typically on Saturdays and sometimes on Thursday nights. The one I attended on June 8th at 10 o'clock in the morning was a lecture on Richard Montgomery, an interesting person, given by Fort Montgomery Battle Site member David Hanson. Please enjoy this and enjoy the pictures that go along with it.
Happens is that he never graduates. He only spends 2 years in college because when he's 18, his father purchases for him an Army commission, that of ensign, in the 17th Regiment of Foot. And this is the banner under which he marched on the 17th Regiment. And he's pretty much, he looked a lot like this, a standard officer. He's got the sword, he's got the tri-corner hat, and he's got this. Anybody know what that's called? It's a gorget. Gorget. They could be in silver, they could be in bronze, but what they were for more than anything was, in the heat of battle with the smoke and everything going on, it was very, very difficult to tell who an officer was. That right there made it very clear who an officer was and who you'd be taking orders from. So, after 6 months of initial military training, Montgomery is shipped to America for his first taste of conflict and combat. And so that's around 1757. What he gets into is, in America, it was known as the French and Indian War, but because he goes way beyond that, it will focus more on the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was actually what's, as you see here, it's the first global conflict. Fought on 5 continents, 3 oceans, and some historians argue that this was the real World War I, and we'll see why in a minute. In America, it's often referred to as the French and Indian War. In the French and Indian War, it stays primarily up in this area right here, but because Richard Montgomery goes well beyond that, that's why we're going into the 7 Years' War history also. So, he starts up here in Lewisburg, is where his first taste of combat is, and the British drive the French out of Lewisburg, and after that conflict, they march everybody down here to Boston, Massachusetts. Richard Montgomery marches from Boston out to Albany, New York, and then up this way. And this is pretty much where he stays, in this area right here during the 7 Years' War. Whoops. 7 Years' War is actually global. Wherever you see this pink area right here, that's where areas of combat were, all around the world. And Richard Montgomery is up in this area, and he also comes down to this area here. It was the war, some people, some historians, when you talk to them, they believe that the war actually was started by then English Lieutenant Colonel George Washington in 1754, when he goes out and creates Fort Necessity, and he screws things up. And the French come down and they kick him out of Fort Necessity, and they lose the battle and they have to come back, so on and so forth. And that's what they figure is pretty much the beginning of the 7 Years' War. From there are Braddock's War up in Fort Duquesne, which is now today's Pittsburgh. He loses that also. And in 1756, England and France technically declare war on each other, and they go after each other for 7 years all around the globe, as we see. The campaigns that Montgomery takes part in are Lewisburg, Cape Breton Island, as we saw before, right up here, way up here, up in northern Canada. His performance is so well that he is actually meritoriously promoted to lieutenant in 1758. Marches from Boston to Lake George via Albany, as I had shown you before, 1759. And then they marched all the way back down to Winter in Philadelphia. They marched back up to Lake Champlain, begin taking the French forts all the way up to Montreal, and take part in the capture of that city in 1760. He garrisons with the 17th Regiment of Foot in the Mohawk Valley, and then moves to New York City to prepare for a Caribbean campaign, which is now where the 7 Years' War comes in, because the French and Indian War never extended to the to the Caribbean. But that's where he ends up going with his regiment. He is shipped to Barbados, prepares for and takes part in the capture of Martinique and the French West Indies, where, again, because of his meritorious performance, he's promoted to captain, or in early 1762. From there, he is shipped to Cuba to take part in the siege and heavy fighting to capture Havana, and that's in late 1762. That campaign is notable for the fact that probably almost half of all the British regulars that fought in the Havana campaign died or were either severely injured by disease and heat. A lot of heat strokes, so on and so forth. Most of the soldiers were not at all accustomed to the heat and the diseases. I don't know why this is crapping out. And the diseases in that area, but they lost nearly half their soldiers just from that. They did take Cuba from the Spanish, and then there was the Treaty of Paris, which gave Cuba back to the Spanish, but the Spanish gave the British Florida in return. And so Captain Montgomery is, at that point, because of his robustness, he does not suffer nearly as badly as the rest of the British troops, but he does suffer, and he ends up going back up to New York City, gets sent back to New York with his regiment for 21 months of recuperation and garrison duty. And so now his life is getting more interesting. In this time period right here, as he marches out to Detroit, as he actually travels out to Detroit, he doesn't march at that point, he meets his future wife, somebody he won't marry for almost 10 years, but he meets her. But you'll have to ask me at the end of the talk here about how that happens. So he ends up marching out to Detroit to assist in diffusing Pontiac's War. Pontiac's War was an Indian conflict that really never generated into a war per se. Captain Montgomery's part in it ended up being more administrative, and he was almost an ambassador. And then when that finally was over with, in the middle of 1764, he gets leave to go back to England. He spends most of the next nearly 8 years traveling all over England. His duties include recruiting, training, and administration functions. During this time, his political views mature, and he begins to view the cabinet system of British government as corrupt and self-serving. One of the things that happens when you're a captain, when you're getting to the higher ranks, is you do what again is the social equivalent of networking, and you begin to meet people, and you begin to get into groups and so on and so forth. And so he got into the London area, got into meeting and talking with a number of very conservative thinkers in government, MPs and so on and so forth, who were opposed to the policies of the current British government, and began to find common ground with them. And so as he goes on and he talks more and more with these people, he sees more and more what the government is doing, he's becoming resistant to what it is that the British government is doing here. And as the British government follows more and more along that path in England and in America, he becomes more and more resistant to that. It's just something to keep in mind as we go forward.
Would any of his viewpoints have been influenced by his growing up in Ireland?
I'm sorry?
Would any of his viewpoints have been influenced by growing up in Ireland? Because Ireland was always the, stepdaughter, stepchild.
Again, he was the son of landed gentry. So he was in that top level. He was not a potato farmer. He was in a completely different class, and at that time classes were very, very important. And so he would not have, in his time in Ireland, very, very, the society was very English regulated, I'll say that. And so he was in that upper class of society, and so that's what he would have seen, that's what he would have known. He would have not been one of the people looking for resistance back when he was in Ireland. At this time now, he's really just spending all of his time in England. And so now it's more his own personal taste of what the government is doing than being influenced by the people around him that are resistant. And then I don't know how many people know that you would actually buy your commissions in the English Army, okay? And so because of his political views, his attempt to purchase a peacetime major's commission fails, and he decides to retire from the Army, become a gentleman farmer in America. So he buys books, he buys scientific equipment, gets himself all ready, settles all his affairs in England, and then at 33 years old, he returns to New York City in late 1772 to begin the gentleman farmer chapter of his life. One of the things that he did when he was in New York City 9 years ago, garrisoned in New York, recovering from the illnesses that he suffered while he was down in Cuba area, is that he did also networking. Again, as a captain in the British Army, you're now allowed into certain select circles of much higher social class people, and so he would network in New York City. So when he comes back to New York City, there's already a bunch of people that he knows. And so through the contacts in New York City, he purchased a farm just north of Manhattan in Kingsbridge in very early 1763. 1,000 acres of land. From just north of Spite and Dival, right up in this area here, almost all the way up to Albany on the eastern side of the Hudson River. Huge, huge landowners. So there is a painted portrait of Janet Livingston and her childhood home in Claremont, New York, which you can still visit today. You can go up and take a tour of Claremont today. So they go through courtship. Janet is not married at this point because the Rubes in New York, they had a whole no interest at all for the family. The Livingston family, is right up there, the very, very top of the social status. They are, I think the only family over them is the Beekmans, but they marry into the Beekman family. And they're up there in the very top socially high status with the Van Rensselaers and the Van Cortlandts and the Delanceys in New York City and so on, very, very high up. And so the family wants only the very best for their daughter, and so they're only going to take the cream of the crop, as it were, to marry their daughter, and so they never seem to find him until Richard comes along. And they do about a month-long investigation of Richard, and they are ecstatic about him. They know he's a combat veteran, a former British officer, he's a landowner. He's about the best person that they've ever seen come by, and they are ecstatic over him, and they give their consent for them to be married. So Richard at 34 and Janet at 29 are married July 24th, 1773. They move into this cottage on property owned by Janet. You can also visit this house today in Rhinebeck. And I have the address on the additional information sheet that's back there. So that's actually the picture I went up and took of the cottage where they lived. It's not in the same place. I think that because they have a big hospital now up in Rhinebeck, and this cottage was on that property. And so like they did with, I'm trying to think of the mansion right up here on the Hudson River. I can't think of the name right off the top of my head. They actually moved the mansion from Montrose, the property of Montrose VA Hospital, and they moved it up to Garrison. And so they did the same thing here. They moved it off that hospital, that property that was there, and they moved it down to a lot in the middle of Rhinebeck. And so yes, you can still visit that house today. An 18 parcel of land just south of Rhinebeck by her grandfather, Beekman, which Richard starts to add to, farm, and build their eventual home. This right here is Route 9 today. You come around, you make a big sweeping left turn right here, and you come up into Rhinebeck. Dutchess County Fairgrounds is right over there. All of this area down here was the 818-acre parcel that was given to Janet by the Beekmans. He begins to build a one-story federal-style house, and he's now in constant contact with many of the influential men in Dutchess County. You're going to see where this goes. The house is about 2/3 completed when he is elected to serve in the New York Provincial Congress in New York City, May 1775. Yeah, again, many of the influential men in Dutchess County who are going to be voting for the for the people to serve in the Provincial Congress. He spent from 1773, when he got married, to May of 1775, almost 2 years, going to parties with them, working with their farms, purchasing things from them, so on and so forth. And so he's now a very well-known, very well-respected member of the Livingston family in Dutchess County. And yes, he gets elected to serve in the Provincial Congress. Montgomery involves himself in many committees of the Provincial Congress, and his competence is quickly noted and appreciated, such that the Continental Congress, now down in Philadelphia, is made aware of him, and on June 15th, he's appointed to be a brigadier general. And he's third in command under only Major General Schuyler, who is the commander of all military forces in New York, and General Washington himself. On July 1st, he and Schuyler begin planning and preparing supplies of men for the invasion of Canada. Partially due to the colonists' experience in the French and Indian War, with what happened at that time, Congress is very aware of the invasion highway that was created by the confluence of the Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the Hudson River. Very easy to move troops up and down through that highway right there. And so what they resolved to do is they actually want to kick the British out of Canada completely, so that avenue cannot be used as they go forward with essentially their revolution. And so what they do is they task General Schuyler and now Brigadier General Montgomery with kicking the British out of Canada. Okay, so now they have to begin planning for the invasion and go up there and kick them out. The basic plan is to use Fort Ticonderoga as the base of operation, go north, take forts at St. John's and Chambly, and then get to Montreal, conquer that, and then from there, go up and do Quebec. General Washington approves a reinforcement force led by Colonel Benedict Arnold 5 years before he becomes a traitor, to travel up through Maine in support of Montgomery to help him take the fortress of Quebec, probably beyond the island up here that he had done 15 years earlier. The fortress of Quebec is probably as strong as or stronger than that is, certainly stronger than anything else that they had seen so far, so they're going to need help. So you have two forces going up, this way and this way. Many books exist which detail the arduous campaigns of both Montgomery and Arnold into Canada and up to the outskirts of the fortress of Quebec. Especially the one that Arnold did. It was absolutely brutal. The maps that he had were very poor, out of date. The distance that they had to cover was twice what they had planned for. People died along the route. You had entire regiments decide to just up and leave, so on and so forth. So it was very, very difficult, very arduous trip up to the outskirts of Quebec by both armies. But they did get there eventually. So, Montgomery and Arnold have a council of war. They look at the maps and they decide what they're going to do to force the entrance to the fortress of Quebec, which is right through here. This is the entrance. They're going to decide on a pincer plan. And if you know what a basic pincer plan is, you have two forces coming in on a single objective. So they're going to use a pincer plan to force the main gate of the fortress, Arnold from the north and Montgomery from the south. In heavy snow, because now this is December 31st, New Year's Eve, 4 a.m. on December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1775. The southern force, led by Montgomery, is mowed down by a cannon from a blockhouse right down here. And at 37 years old, he is killed along with probably at least 13 other soldiers, and at that point the whole southern force realizes that they're not going to be able to get past this blockhouse, as heavily armed as it is, and so they retreat. Arnold up here went through about an hour-long battle with British that were coming out of the fort gates here and trying to stop them from coming up here. The British eventually win. They capture most of the force. Arnold is able to escape And he ends up going back to his starting point over here, and then he with the rest of the forces that he has, in combination with some of the forces from Montgomery, lay siege to the fortress of Quebec, and they maintain that siege for about 5 or 6 months. So, in Quebec today, there are plaques at the location of Montgomery's death, where his body was placed in a coffin, where he was buried, January 4th, 1776, and then where 13 of the soldiers who were killed with him were buried. So all this history is still sitting up in Quebec. The aftermath for Janet in the country. Unfortunately, Janet loses her grandfather Beekman 2 weeks before the 1776 New Year, and her father a week after. The death of the 3 most important men in her life so close together is devastating, and she remains unmarried the rest of her life, and she lives another 52 or 53 years. The Continental Congress discusses delaying the news of Montgomery's death for fear of severely impairing the morale of the country and its citizen soldiers. The news leaks out, though, and Congress renews its commitment to more men and supplies for the Canadian campaign. They end up with sending up enough men and supplies, about 2,500 men end up in the siege around the fortress of Quebec, and they sustain that siege for about 5 months, but then in May of 1776, the British come up with about 10,000 more soldiers, 2,000 German Hessians and about 8,000 British soldiers. They come up. Arnold realizes that there's no way that he's going to be able to maintain a siege, and they evacuate Quebec, and they retreat all the way back down to Fort Ticonderoga. And so that's the end of the invasion of Canada. The effort that Britain puts into repulsing the Canadian invasion pulls men of support from maintaining their hold on Boston. Washington surrounds Boston with Ticonderoga's guns, if you know about that story. And the British evacuate on March 17th, leaving New England for good. They never come back. But so you know about the story of General Knox and dragging 59 pieces of artillery from Ticonderoga down past Albany and all the way out to Boston. So that's what goes on as as Montgomery is up fighting in Quebec. Knox has started this, and he's going down through. And as the British are looking at Canada and they're looking at Boston, they miss Knox and this train of artillery completely. And so when the cannon end up poking out over the hills at Dorchester Heights and around Boston, the British are completely surprised. They have no idea how it's got here. Oh my God. And they realize that these are 18 and 24 pounders that they brought down. And they can clearly hit the ships out in the harbor and every building inside of Boston. And the British realize that there is no being able to sustain their force in Boston any longer, and so they pick up not just their troops, but a lot of the Tories that decided they did not want to live under colonial rule anymore, and they all near Claremont, her childhood home, where she builds and moves into a French chateau-style home she names Chateau de Montgomery, now called Montgomery Place, living there until her death in 1827. This is another home you can visit today. She sells the previous residence, the one that Richard started, to her sister, and it burns to a shell in 1828. It did not burn to the ground, it burned to a shell, because they took that shell and they rebuilt it. It's rebuilt with 2 more floors and other changes, and it is then called Grasmere. It has numerous family owners, and a future Columbia University president was born there. It's permanently closed now, with locked gates and no trespassing signs. The Continental Congress, very soon after they hear about Montgomery's death, they order a monument to Montgomery from France in 1776. It gets completed, and then it sits in storage for about 11 years until it's placed in St. Paul's Episcopal Church on Manhattan Island, 1787. It's still there today. You can go down and visit today. And this dedication right here was written by, give me a second, the name will come to me, Benjamin Franklin. Janet eventually gets the governor of New York to repatriate Montgomery's remains out of Canada to the U.S. in 1818. He's buried with great fanfare and ceremony in front of the monument July 8th of that year. And everyone from that time period says they have never seen such an outpouring of public support and actual grief since Washington had passed away many years before. So that's how well revered he was. General Montgomery is revered around the country for 100 years after his death. 16 states have counties named for him, and at least 5 states have towns or cities named for him. The latest one being Montgomery, Alabama in 1871. I don't recall, I did not get to do the research on when Montgomery, New York, right over here, was named. But that's one of the 5 states, towns that have named after him. Across the U.S., statues of Montgomery and roadside history markers, such as all these shown, continue to ensure that General's legacy is not lost to history. The Fort Montgomery, which you're all here visiting today, is one of 2 forts in New York to be called such. The other one was built in the 1840s at the very top of Lake Champlain, has no notable history, and today is nothing but a derelict ruin. Our fort here was incomplete when it was overrun in October 1777 by British forces as they were heading north to reinforce General Burgoyne's invasion of New York from Canada. Fortunately, the British invasion failed with the Patriot victory at Saratoga. To me, it may not be to you, to me it's one of the saddest ironies of our early history that this fort that bears Montgomery's name was destroyed by troops attempting to support the very invasion by the British that Montgomery had worked so hard and sacrificed so much for to prevent. General Richard Montgomery was our country's first military hero, not just because he gave his life for the revolutionary cause, but also because he lived and exemplified the qualities of leadership, duty, and patriotism that was, in the eyes of his contemporaries and even of his enemies, second only to General Washington himself. Such a life should be appreciated, revered, and hopefully never forgotten. That's my talk.
As a young boy and a Fort Montgomery young professional trespasser, used to go down here to Fort Montgomery long before Jack Meade did his digs in the early 70s, full of briars. It was amusing to us kids. The mine that was there has had a shaft that has been filled in. It was fully open back then. And we used to let our imaginations wander. And isn't it wonderful that this project over the last 30 years has been restored, has become a very important site for the realization of how important the great chain at West Point was, preempted by the one at Fort Montgomery.